In late 2013, an independent South African game development studio, the Brotherhood, launched their first crowdfunding campaign for their first game, a traditional point-and-click sci-fi horror adventure game called STASIS on Kickstarter. They also crowdfunded and brought us an African post-apocalyptic adventure game, Beautiful Desolation, in 2020, which I have also played and made a separate video of its own. What they wanted to do with STASIS, created by Christopher Bischoff, was to reinvigorate the mature isometric adventure gaming genre by combining an exciting sci-fi horror story and awesome graphics with gameplay mechanics following the classics like Space Quest, King's Quest, the Monkey Island series, The Dig, and Day of the Tentacle, while visually and graphically taken after 1998's isometric psychological horror adventure game Sanitarium. The campaign was successful and the game got funded in early December of that year, raising $140,000, including the separate PayPal donations, the initial goal being $100,000. The game was then released in late August 2015, but I played and beat the game for the first time in summer of 2017. And since the Brotherhood's next title, Stasis Bone Totem, or Stasis 2, is supposed to come out sometime in the second quarter of this year, 2022, I decided to revisit Stasis almost 5 years later, to refresh my memories of the game and its events. And while I'm at it, I may as well include the standalone prequel chapter called Kane, that was their last Kickstarter stretch goal. So how is the Brotherhood's first commercial, crowdfunded point-and-click sci-fi horror adventure game? My name is Siperos and these are my thoughts on Stasis and Kane. The story starts with a large, derelict-looking spaceship drifting in the cold, dark space, giving me alien vibes. We are then shown a man being released from a cryo-glass tube, and there's not another living soul in sight. In fact, the ship looks like it's been abandoned for a while. The confused man is our protagonist, John Maracek, a schoolteacher who had gone for a vacation with his wife and daughter and went to cryogenic sleep for the duration of their long journey, only to wake up on this unfamiliar ship. Naturally, as a devoted husband and father, his first priority is to find his family. As he looks around the ship, trying to find other people, he comes across Tia via radio and learns that he's on a self-sustaining deep space medical research vessel, the Groom Lake, orbiting aimlessly around the gas giant Neptune, outside of the jurisdictional influence of Earth. The Groom Lake is owned by a multinational technological, medical and scientific research company, Kane Corporation. An uncaring, profit-driven evil corporation, of course, performing unethical and illicit research and horrific experiments on humans on the vessel for more productive results. Many of the test subjects being drifters, prisoners, and even abducted civilians, including children like John and his wife and daughter. And something had gone terribly wrong while John was in cryostasis. Only the love for his family and the will to get them off this ghost ship before it plunges further into the swirling blue methane clouds of Neptune motivates him to venture forward through the horrors on the Groom Lake. The plot itself is not original by any means, but it's still a very well told story. What makes it so good, disturbing and horrifying is how realistically and believably it's told. I can easily imagine a corporation like Kane existing in the far future, conducting illegal experiments in space out of the reach of annoying government restrictions and ire of the public, while justifying their research to be for the betterment of humankind at the expense of a few. The environmental storytelling and PDAs left behind by the crew, which I will talk about more later, do most of the storytelling excellently. I also like how the game doesn't straight up tell you what exactly happened on the Groom Lake, and is more subtle about the events, leaving you guessing and theorizing. There were multiple scientific projects being conducted on the vessel, and all of them seem to have contributed to the disaster. The story has some memorable scares, heartbreaking and even gut-wrenching moments that I'll definitely never forget. The game doesn't end happily, but bittersweetly, and I think it was a proper way to end a dark and mature horror story in space, such as Stasis. The characters, however, the few that are still alive on the ship, are admittedly not very memorable or interesting. The protagonist, John Maracek, voiced by
Rebecca? I need to... My wife? My child? I need to find someone. I need to get out of here. Holy mother of...
I actually don't know. They didn't specify who voiced who in the credits. But regardless, John is your average working Joe. A family man and... well, there's not really much else to say about him. Normally I would consider a bland protagonist like John as a negative thing in an adventure game, but after finishing the game for the second time, I think that maybe John's blandness and averageness is intentional, to make him more relatable and sympathetic to his struggles. The way John acts and reacts to the terrible things happening on the Groom Lake is very human. He's confused, scared, vulnerable, desperate, and gets more abhorred the more he learns about the dark secrets of Kane Corporation.
The words. I can't even.
What do you see?
What kind of a monster would do this? These women. These poor women. This is torture. This is
Science.
The story of Stasis isn't about John Maracek, but the dark side of the highly advanced dystopian future envisioned by Christopher Bischoff. And John is just one of the many victims of Kane Corporation and their scientific ambitions and greed. The only other characters alive on the Groom Lake are Tia, whom I mentioned earlier. The only friendly living being on the vessel who helps you throughout the game via a radio, and works as John's moral support because, my god, he sure needs some.
In the crew quarters, you should be close to an infirmary with a DNA sequencer. If you could get your blood into the sequencer, I can scan the ship for familial DNA, and then we can find your daughter. Then...
we can use her DNA to find Ellen.
Exactly.
And Dr. Malan, the Special Projects Director for Kane Corporation, and thus one of the head honchos of the research vessel. He is ruthless, cruel, and about as cold and uncaring to human suffering as the cosmos itself, and has a god complex. Not seemingly fazed by the fact that his creations, or beautiful children as he calls them, that somehow were set loose had killed nearly everyone on board. When I was reading his PDA entry about how he admired his children who had none of the trappings of morality, I couldn't help but think of the science officer and android Ash from Alien.
I admire its purity. A survivor. Unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality.
All the living characters are voiced acted and, while the performances are not amazing, although some of John's reactions of anger, despair and sorrow were convincing, they are good enough. Funnily enough, the most interesting characters are those who are not alive anymore in the game. Instead, you learn about the many other crew members of the Groom Lake on more intimate level by reading their PDAs, personal digital assistants. Reading those were some of the best moments in the game for me. Now, I know that it may not speak very positively for the rest of the game if reading people's diary entries out of all things is the most enjoyable thing about the game. And I know that many people, myself included, have always half-jokingly questioned why characters in video games leave PDAs, diary entries or any messages behind in dire life and death situations like this, outside of obvious storytelling and gameplay purposes by the developers. And I remember at least one character questioning it themselves in their own entry in Stasis. But these PDAs made sense, at least to me, because they were supposed to be for work-related reports and memos, but people tended to use them as their diaries as well, and they are simply very well written. Every crew member I read about felt like a real human being, each with their own unique pasts, backgrounds, feelings, regrets, desires, flaws, secrets and dreams. Professionally, they varied from simple janitors to engineers, nurses and security officers, all the way up to the highest ranking scientists. Most of them were normal, decent everyday working people, and that made them relatable. One such character whom I felt sort of a connection to was Neville, who had always just wanted to go to space, even if all he did was sweeping and dusting on a ship. During his free time, he was making a comic book about himself as a space adventurer, which made me wonder if Neville and his story was a nod to Sierra's Space Quest series. And even during his final hours when he knew he was going to die, he didn't regret going to space and just wanted to become one with the universe. I could easily imagine myself as Neville because, for one, I would also be hyped about being in space, and if I was working on a spaceship as a crew member, I would also most likely be a mere janitor too or something similar. Not a ship captain, scientist or engineer. You learn about the working conditions, rumors what the crew who didn't know the details about the projects think is going on, and how they handled the crisis when shit hit the fan. But the researchers in charge of the shady projects, like Dr. Malan, were more twisted, ambitious, greedy, or just psychopaths playing with people's lives like a god. And it makes sense for them to be like that, Because only people with no morals, remorse or empathy could do all those messed up things to other human beings in the name of scientific progress as their justification. You need to be some of the worst people in the universe to be able to sleep at night after conducting such inhumane experiments and even disposing still living test subjects regarded as failures. The PDAs don't contain any crucial information or hints that you need to solve puzzles, so you could skip them if you wanted to. But they give a lot of context to the past horrid events, give the poor victims a voice, and I think you would be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't read at least the ones regarding the research projects and learn what exactly Kane Corporation tried to accomplish on the Groom Lake. Graphically, Stasis is a beautiful game. The 2D scenes from isometric perspective are extremely detailed, atmospheric, and the environments have their own disturbing stories to tell. The locations are various testing chambers, laboratories, narrow corridors, claustrophobic ducts, sewers, because even in space we can't escape sewer levels. Everything that you would expect to see in a deep space research vessel. There are also some unexpectedly stunning looking scenes as well, namely the locations in the hydroponics section of the ship where nature has taken over. You'll see lots of nightmarish body horror, like the self-operated spine surgery scene that people will definitely remember Stasis for. And you see only glimpses of some of the creatures that are lurking in the shadows, looking for more victims to hunt and slaughter. The isometric perspective, the darkness, and the fact that we never get a really good look at the monsters leave some room for players' imagination to run wild and fill the gaps whenever they do see them briefly. After all, humans' own minds create the most terrifying monsters. The sound design is also superb with all the metallic clanging noises and occasional distant screams that made me jump a couple of times at first. Background noises such as the looping announcements and product advertisements worked as haunting contrast to the dark and otherwise quiet and lifeless environment, creating an eerie atmosphere.
Kane Corporation, the last truly great company, wants to thank all employees for their dedicated service. This year's profits are up 20% across all sectors. Life expectancy is up 5 years. We are at the cusp of greatness. In the words of Henry Kane himself, humanity has chosen us to do its good work, and together we will not let them down. Kane Corporation. Tomorrow's technology. Today.
The sparingly used, barely there kind of music was composed by Mark Morgan. That name should ring a bell, for he has made music for games such as Fallout, Planescape Torment, Wasteland 2 and 3, Torment, Tides of Numenera, The Bard's Tale 4 and more. The 3D character models, however, are not as fleshed out, not that you'll see many other living beings besides John, and even his model is not very detailed, being shrouded in shadows and darkness most of the time. Due to his full bodysuit, he occasionally even looked naked to me, and his animations can be stiff and awkward at times, especially when compared to the Brotherhood's second game, Beautiful Desolation, where character models and animation quality have been improved a great deal. Another thing that I noticed was that the pathfinding AI was not always the smartest, sometimes making John, for example, run around a reception desk to reach the door that was right in front of him without any obstacles blocking the more straightforward path. This was also improved in Beautiful Desolation, so what little animation related or technical flaws Stasis has, the developers have addressed them and improved their craft since then. The puzzle design of Stasis follows the same classic adventure game roots that inspired it. You have an inventory limited to 6 item slots, and the game's puzzles and overall progression are designed with that in mind. Puzzles themselves vary from logical and obvious to obtuse and hard to see. While most of the items can be seen and found easily enough, some of them glowing faintly, including all the PDAs, there are a few that are harder to spot and require some pixel hunting to find, like this body part that is found on this wall covered by blood and tissue. I actually had to look this one up from a walkthrough. So there can be some frustrating moments where you look for any new items and try to combine or use every item on everything until you find the solution. The best thing about Stasis' puzzle design, however, is how well the puzzles fit the story, theme and environment. None of them felt shoehorned in for the sake of adding more gameplay. Instead, they felt like natural obstacles and problems one could expect to face on a derelict spacecraft such as this, and sometimes one must resort to even extreme measures to overcome them. They fit the story's flow and storytelling flawlessly. Because Stasis is a mature horror adventure game inspired by Sierra titles, you can also die in it by either screwing up a little puzzle, going to places where you shouldn't before doing something specific first, or by committing suicide in various brutal ways with the items you are carrying. There are no death traps at every corner, and you can avoid most of the deaths by simply using common sense and by having self-preservation, but I still recommend that you save often. Before I wrap this up, I want to briefly talk about the standalone prequel chapter Kayne, that was released in late January of 2017, almost 1.5 years after Stasis. Since Kayne is virtually identical to Stasis when it comes to the presentation, art style, tone, gameplay, storytelling techniques, amount of body horror and gore, and it even takes place in the same universe, I'm not going to delve as deep into it. I'm mostly going to focus on what Kayne does better or worse than Stasis. The first thing where Kayne beats Stasis is the price tag, because Kayne doesn't have one. It's a free-to-play game. And for a free-to-play game, Kayne is extremely high quality with beautiful graphics, competent and effective voice acting, cinematic cutscenes and thought-provoking story, albeit not as subtle or as well developed as that of Stasis. And it's not a short game either, about 4 to 5 or so hours of playtime, while Stasis is at least twice as long. The protagonist of Kayne's story is Hadley, a young woman who got herself pregnant but doesn't want to keep the child, so she went to Milan Memorial Hospital for a routine abortion to get it over with. That's what was supposed to happen. Instead, she wakes up in a dark operating room that is nothing like the pristine white clinic she had originally went to and fell asleep at right before her supposed operation started. And she is very much pregnant. 9 months judging from the size of her belly. It turns out she is in a now mostly abandoned medical facility owned by Kayne Corporation, and they are about to extract Hadley's fetus out of her body. Of course she manages to get off the operating table in time, killing the large hulking suited man in the process, and now she must find her way out of this hellhole and learn what these people want with her baby. So like I said, Kayne's story is not as deep, multi-layered or even as subtle as the story of Stasis. Which is partly understandable because it's only a few hours long, so they couldn't pack as much depth into it, or give breathing room for the story to develop. I did like the ending though, even more than Stasis' ending in fact. Although if you read the PDAs and pay attention, the big twist can't be easily predicted. The worst thing about the story in my opinion are the few characters that you read about from their PDAs and who are in charge of the projects at the facility. They are all unlikable and even stereotypically evil. One of the head researchers is a zealous Christian who practices self-flagellation, quotes the Bible often in his PDA, and seems to worship the founder of Kayne Corporation as if he was Jesus. And a young, misogynistic, alpha male wannabe, grade A asshole and a pervert who does his own secret experiments to create a sexy monster to fulfill his sexual fantasies. Just to mention a couple out of 7 or so characters. All of them are so awful or insufferable with next to no redeemable qualities that they felt like cartoon villains compared to the more level-headed and normal people I read about in Stasis, and thus I had a hard time to take this game's story as seriously. Their ugly mugshots are not making them look any less sinister either. Hadley is voiced by Sarah Ann Williams.
And to think a fall could have been a good thing for me a few months ago. Oh, uncalled for, Hadley. Funny, but uncalled for.
And the reason I know this is because the game has only 2 main voice actors, or artists, the other one being Ryan Cooper. Williams is also the same voice actress who voiced Pooch in Beautiful Desolation.
I also have a Class A asshole detector, and it is currently going off the charts.
But back to Hadley. I quite like her, even more than John.
I love Juca-Cola. Love it.
They say it's made from people.
Juca-Cola is made of love and happiness.
I like how she's obviously very scared, but uses humor to cope with it, telling bad jokes to herself.
Don't want to take the phrase bun in the oven too literally.
And a heavily pregnant woman as a protagonist is something we don't see often in adventure games, or video games in general. The only other game with a pregnant protagonist that I can think of right now is Amnesia Rebirth. 9 months pregnancy makes her even more vulnerable and us to fear for her and her baby. Or, well, that's how it should have worked, but she seems to survive from serious hazards, such as falls and explosions, that would have normally killed or at least seriously injured the woman, but killed the fetus, and yet they both turn out just fine. On the plus side, Hadley grows and matures as a character in such a short period of time in a way that feels natural and not forced, which I think is impressive given the game's length.
It's not nothing. Sounds like you have a life most are envious of. You have kids, right? A real family. Like people know you exist. Real life. Some of us never got off the starting line.
You will have a family soon.
When I die, I want to leave something behind. You have that. I have student debt and a goldfish.
Your legacy is the child inside of you.
This baby deserves more than what I could ever give. It deserves to be part of something. Something bigger than me. Family. A home. A future.
Hadley's character model is also more detailed and animations are better and smoother, so the Brotherhood had clearly improved their craft since Stasis, and it shows in Kane. The inventory is larger this time with no limits to how many items you can carry. All the pickable items are also more noticeable this time around as well, and the puzzle design overall follows that of Stasis. Some of the puzzles, however, are even more obscure in Kane. They do make sense, so it's not that they are illogical, but they are harder to figure out. Like this part here where I had to use the blade on this exposed insulation to carve a hole and drop down through it to another room. I mean, sure, makes sense. I just never realized that's what I had to do. I had to look this one up as well, because at the start of the game there is no clear direction or objective that I had to try to accomplish. I just had to look around to try and find new clues, items that I could pick up, use them on everything to see what sticks, and places where I could go. But soon enough the game does give you more clear objectives, like find a way to power up this door so it can open. So the puzzles will keep you occupied in Kane, some even to the point of frustration. What doesn't help either is the fact that, unlike in Stasis in comparison, there is quite a bit of backtracking in Kane, which can become annoying. I recommend you have a pen and paper ready to write down or draw certain passwords that you need to unlock more locations and the ID numbers of certain areas whose temperatures and humidity you need to adjust. Stasis is an excellent sci-fi horror adventure game, one of the best that has come out in recent years. The graphics are fabulous and environments detailed, the horror comes from the atmosphere and great sound design instead of cheap jump scares. The story may not be original, but it's very well and believably told with a bittersweet ending. It's grounded enough in realism with convincing and interesting flawed characters who feel like real, everyday working people you can empathize with. Even if most of them are dead, you don't see any pictures of, and just read about them from their PDAs. Even the puzzles for the most part don't hinder the storytelling and instead feel like a natural part of the journey. After replaying Stasis, it made me even more hyped for Stasis Bone Totem. Kane follows its bigger brother in terms of storytelling techniques, sound and graphic design, even improves some character models and animation, and puzzle design, though some of the puzzles are even more obscure and harder to figure out. The story is weaker, although still thought-provoking. The characters, outside of Hadley obviously, are just awful and shallow compared to the crew I read about in Stasis. So Kane has its own share of flaws, but as a free-to-play game, it's absolutely phenomenal with its high production quality most freeware games can only dream of. Naturally, I recommend both games for sci-fi and horror fans. Since Stasis and Kane are not strongly linked story-wise, you can play them in any order you want. If you're still not sure if you would enjoy a game like Stasis, at least pick up and try out Kane. And there you have it, folks. Those were my thoughts on Stasis and Kane. What are your thoughts on these games? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.